Welcome back. Let's now finally set up Express, create a simple server, and do some basic routing just to get an initial feeling of how we actually work in Express. And so in this video, we're actually going to start working on the Naders project. So the big main project that is part of this course. So just like before, please go ahead and get the starter project from the course files. So I already have it here and I have it open up in my VS Code. So let's take just a very quick look at what we have here. So we have the prior configuration file, just like we set up before. I also have a config file for ESLint, and ESLint we haven't set up at this point, but we're going to do that also later in this section. Okay, for now I just want to start coding and not worry about linting our code. So linting is just to fix some errors, but again, we're going to do that later. Then here we have just some files for later, like CSS images. Okay, and now also, for example, some data that we need to build our application. Okay, and again, we're going to start using this data here throughout this section. Anyway, we now have a brand new project, and the first thing that we usually do in a new project is to create the package.json file, just like I mentioned before. So we did that in the node farm project, and now we're going to do that here as well. So I open up the integrated terminal, and you can do that by hitting this shortcut here, or just come here to view and then terminal. So let me put it up a little bit so you can see it. And so remember, the command is npm init. Okay, so we give a name to the project. It's called Naders. Now, okay, it cannot have any capital letters. So let's do that again. The version is 1. Description, let's just say learning Node Express and MongoDB. Entry point index.js. Well, actually, we're going to use app.js now. So let's call it app.js. We have no task command, no git, no keywords. Author is me. And that's it. So, okay. And so here we have package.json, right? So just like before, nothing new here. So now it's time to install Express. So npm I Express. Now I'm going to use Express 4 here, which is at the point of recording the latest version. But for some time, the Express team has been working on version 5, and so that is a major version which could introduce breaking changes if you installed that one. Now there's actually not a lot of stuff changing in version 5, but to make sure, please install Express at version 4, just like I'm doing. And so in order to do that, just hit at 4. And that will then install the latest version inside of 4. So with the latest minor and patch versions. So 4.16.4. Okay, so that's the version that I'm using now in this course. And yours will probably be a later version, but as long as you have the 4 here in the beginning, you should be fine. All right? So you see that it actually created our node modules folder over here. And so now we're ready to start. So I'm creating a new file, and it's called app.js. So it's kind of a convention to have all the Express configuration in app.js. Okay, and so that's what I'm using here now. So we have now the warning that it can't load ESLint. And again, we're going to configure that later throughout this section. So let's now use Express. And so I'm going to require, of course, the Express package. So nothing new at this point. Give it a save. And you see that Prettier already did its magic here by adding this semicolon and also adding this new line down here. Okay, so we have Express imported. And now what we do is to create a variable called app. So again, that's kind of a standard. So app, and assign the result of calling Express. Okay, and so that's actually it. So Express, so this here is a function which upon calling will add a bunch of methods to our app variable here. Okay, and the first one that we're going to use is actually app.listen to basically start up a server. So that is a bit similar to what we did before with the HTTP package in the previous sections, right? So again, keep in mind that Express is 100% Node.js under the hood, and some of the things work in a very similar way here in Express. All right. Again, it simply makes our lives a bit easier by taking some of the complexity away from us. So just like before, into app.listen we pass in the port, and let's actually create a variable for that here before. So port, and let's say 3000 for now, and we're going to change that a bit later. So we pass in the port and a callback function. So again, this is the callback function that will be called as soon as the server starts listening. All right. So let's simply do a console.log here, app running on port. All right, so that is our server now actually already listening. Now what we need to do next is to define routes. And once more, we actually already kind of defined routes before in the Node Farm project. Remember that, but it works very differently with Express. So remember that routing means basically to determine how an application responds to a certain client request. So to a certain URL, right? And actually it's not just the URL, but also the HTTP method, which is used for that request. So remember that from the HTTP lecture that we had before. So how do we do that? Well, it's very, very simple in Express. All we do is app, then the HTTP method that we want to respond to, and let's start with the simplest one, which is get, and then the URL. And we're just specifying the kind of root URL here. All right? So again, the route is basically the URL, which in this case is just this root URL, and also the HTTP method, which is get in this case. Okay? Now, what do we actually want to happen when someone hits that URL with a GET request? Well, whatever we want to do, we need to specify it in a callback function, which we specify as the second argument. And so we have a callback function, so just like this, and this callback function can accept a couple of arguments. And the most basic one, so the ones that we usually always need, are the request and the response. Okay? And so in that regard, it is again very similar to what we did before in the Node Farm project, right? So back then, when we started our server, we also had access to the request and the response object. Now, they are a little bit different here in Express. They have a lot more data and methods on them, but the idea is exactly the same. So you see that Express apps, and so also Node apps for that matter, are all about requests and responses. Simply because that is how the web actually works, just as we learned in the previous sections, right? So what do we want to do now? Well, all we want to do is to send some data back very quickly. So we can use the response object, and on there we can use the send method and specify something that we want to send back. Hello from the server side. So just some string again that we want to send back. We can also specify the status code, and that's very easily. All we have to do is to, before we actually send this string to the client, we just add status before that. So the status method, and in here we specify our code. And again, we're going to use 200 for OK. And so that's actually all we have to do. So let's very quickly test this out and then add some more stuff to it. Okay. So let's use nodemon app.js. Let's see what happens. And our app is running on port 3000. Great. And how do we now test this API? Well, that's why we installed Postman, right? So let's open up Postman. And actually it's still here from the last lecture. And so let's go ahead and delete this and write the URL, or actually the IP for the localhost, and then our port. So that is exactly the same as we did in the Node Farm project, right? And we're hitting just the root. And so we can write the slash, or it works just the same without anything. So let's send this. And indeed, here we go. Hello from the server side. So that's amazing. It already works. And just to make sure, we would of course get the exact same result in the browser. So if I copy this here, you will see the same result. Okay? But again, we're going to use Postman because it makes all this API testing a lot easier for us. Okay, and you will see once we really start using more and more features of this great application. All right. Now going back here, let's add some more stuff because send simply sends this string here back to the client. But it's also very easy to send JSON to the client. So instead of using send, let's actually use JSON. So the JSON method, and then in here we can pass in an object. So let's do it like this, so let's say this is the message, and then just some other field here, natures. Okay, and so now you see that Prettier here auto-formatted this for us, and I also want this in another line. Okay, we're missing the comma here, of course, but the Prettier extension still put it up here for some reason. But of course that doesn't really matter, it's just a matter of formatting. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens now. And so now we have our nicely formatted JSON here. It gives us all these different colors here for the keys and for the values. Here we have the status code, here we have the time it took to do this request, and we also have the size of the response. We could, for example, change the code here very easily. So 404 is not found, remember. Do it again, and then here you see 404 not found. So that's the kind of stuff that Postman is really great for. Let's actually increase the size of all this. Okay, and so let's now continue, just add something else here. Just something very easy. Remember, all of this is just to test it out, to get our feet wet and start getting a little bit of experience. So remember that this here is the HTTP method for the request, okay? And so this response that we're sending here, so this one here, is only sent when a GET method, so this GET method is sent to our server on this URL, okay? And let me actually show it to you. So if we do, for example, a post, and that's very easy again with Postman. So if we do post, then we will not get anything. Instead, what Express automatically sends back is this HTML here, which says cannot post, and then with a 404 not found. And that's because we don't have any route defined for this URL and for this HTTP method. Okay, and so let's now very quickly do that. So post, we want the same URL, the request and the response object. And let's simply say res.send. You can post to this URL or to this endpoint. Okay, so just so you see that this is how we send different responses for different HTTP methods in the request. So let's run that again. And indeed, you can post to this endpoint with a 200 status code. So this is actually the default one when we do not specify any in our code. Okay, so here we have 404, which is not correct. But again, 200 is actually the default. Another quick thing that I want to show you is that by using this JSON method here, for example, this will automatically set our content type to application JSON. So remember that we did that manually in the Node Farm app when we created our very simple API. So back then, we also sent back some JSON, but we then had to manually define that the content was JSON so that the browser knew what it was expecting, right? But Express takes that work away from us. And let's actually check that. So going back to get, so here we have our result headers. And so here you see that the content type is indeed set to application JSON. Express then also automatically sends a bunch of other headers, for example, this powered by Express, or the date, or the connection. Okay, but again, we're going to take more care of headers a bit later in the course. So this was just a very small and simple example here, but you can already start to appreciate how much easier it is to do this kind of responses. So to create this route in order to respond to client requests in a much easier way than in just plain Node.js, right? And with that being said, in the next video, we're going to learn all about building APIs using the REST architecture so that after that, we can finally start building our API.